1977 marked the birth of the PC era. The launch of the Apple II cemented the idea that computer belongs in every home. Exactly 30 years later, in 2007, the post-PC era began. The release of the first iPhone fundamentally changed our interaction with the digital world. But there are two more dates that brought far less positive shifts. And we are only just beginning to learn how to live with the fallout. WWDC 2020 brought sidebars and toolbars to various iPad applications. The File app, for instance, began to look like a truly professional tool, finally. This and many other changes led to the final long-awaited separation of iPadOS from iOS, a process that began with the splitting of their names a year earlier. But look closely at the cursor. Why is it so radically different from the one we used to in macOS?
We looked at just bringing the traditional arrow pointer over from the Mac, but that didn't feel quite right on iPadOS, where the entire operating system and every app is designed to be used by an input the size of a fingertip.
That didn't feel quite right. That's what he said. And this makes perfect sense because the foundational architecture of iPadOS is built on Steve Jobs' famous fundamental concept of the post-PC era. The iPad is the professional device of this era, single-handedly dominating half the entire tablet market. It is the primary workstation for millions of users. And the introduction of a cursor, especially a context-aware one, was the result of a chain of complex decisions and compromises related specifically to professional workflows and the keyboard hardware. We'll look at those later in this video. This specific implementation was proof of the post-PC concept viability, proof that you can expand functionality without destroying the core concept, but rather organically supplementing it. This video is sponsored by Framer, more on that later. I wouldn't hesitate to say that the post-PC era was Steve Jobs' ultimate dream. The same Jobs who 30 years early in 1977 directly and profoundly influenced the dawn of the personal computer era, PC era, and who in 2007 single-handedly launched the post-PC era with his decisions. While the term itself was coined by MIT scientist David D. Clark, it still was Jobs who actively popularized it starting in 2010. By 2011, he was explicitly calling the iPod, the iPhone and iPad post-PC devices, placing the iPad in the very center of this new reality. And if the word era sound too grandiose to you, here is a brief personal observation. I taught at a college for several years, while simultaneously running my own design studio. In both environments, I interacted heavily with the people half my age, whose first contact with computing happened through smartphones or tablets. Many of them simply do not know how to use desktop computer.
What's a computer?
Not because they're lazy, but because their tasks are perfectly handled by a phone. And when these individuals need to translation to a new professional level, they buy a tablet. There is a massive number of such people. We can see this simply by looking at market volume. The post-PC era is what Steve Jobs truly succeeded in building. It is what lived on and evolved in all this year following his death. But here is another cursor. It arrived with release of iPadOS 26. It abandoned some of the unique innovations of past years, bringing back a tool that is far more familiar specifically to PC-era desktop users. Yes, some of the context awareness and magnetism remain, but its physics and visual appearance have moved much closer to the traditional desktop cursor. Alongside this, we received an entirely new multitasking mode. Stage Manager hasn't gone anywhere, but alongside it, there is now Windowed App Mode, which looks a lot like the macOS desktop. What happened? Why, instead of developing within the existing post-PC framework, is there such a massive drift toward macOS? For years, users begged for proper Finder, full-fledged multitasking and adequate external monitor support. Year after year, tech bloggers released videos titled "This new update changed everything" and "Can the iPad finally be your main computer?" Of course it can. The iPad can be your main computer. This is the beautiful curse of modern operating systems. On any of them, whether it's Windows, Ubuntu or iPadOS, if you overcome your habits, you can accomplish almost any task. except for the mostly high specialized ones. So is it a bad thing that the features users have been requesting for years were finally implemented, making iPadOS much more functional? For answer, let's look at one specific feature: windowed mode. Now, windows of application float freely on the desktop in any numbers and any size. Obviously, this feature emerged at the intersection of three lines. Users asked for more multitasking functionality. The hardware became better at handling multiple concurrent processes. And the previous iteration, the stage manager, proved to be less than optimal. But I'd like to look at the evolution of these modes through the lens of system's own consistency. But first, let's understand how this consistency is created. In this video, I'm speaking critically about visual effects, but the problem isn't the effects themselves. It's the reason they appear and how they interact with other parts of the ecosystem. Visual effects themselves, especially those that imitate physics and optics, are actually a great way to create exactly that anthropological level of design. Precisely to create depth. With the release of the iOS 7 and macOS Yosemite, Apple began to heavily emphasize the blur effect. And paradoxically, the so-called flat design became less flat and more profound, despite a drastic reduction in visible 3D objects. And it's exactly in this context that I wanted to talk more about a new feature in Framer, which is sponsor of today's video. But wait, don't skip ahead. This is very important at integration for me, because it was precisely through no-code web builder and design tools that I once found success with my design studio. A success that turned me from freelancer into a designer whose solutions are literally used by millions of people, from big tech app users to website visitors. As I've mentioned in previous video, I eventually lost that studio due to my management mistakes. A story I plan to share in more detail very soon. So first of all, I just wanted to share my excitement that having direct contact with perhaps one of the main representatives of the no-code industry is a huge deal for me personally. Really, I could only dream of an opportunity like this, making content I love and monetizing it by talking about products I actually used, can personally recommend and genuinely think are cool. But okay, that's all personal and sentimental. The practical reality is that no-code tools act as a layer of abstraction that allow us to get to the core much faster. They let us work on a very deep level with user perception, while factoring out the repetitive technical parts of the job, the parts that rely on established practices and patterns, often taking up 80% of time while only giving 2% impact on the final result. And I'm thrilled to see that Framer continues to expand the capabilities of this exact part of their tool. Look at this. It's their new shaders feature. Now you can create highly impressive visual effects directly on the canvas, without any code. You just drag, drop and tweak. And beyond just looking beautiful, it's also perfectly optimized. But I want to emphasize what shaders actually are. Overly simplified, they are a way to visually imitate physical properties. Surfaces, dynamic lighting, particle behavior. The common denominator here is a connection to real-world physics. And it's precisely within this connection that the opportunity arises to create thoughtful, profound design that connects with the users on a deep anthropological level. Shaders alone don't make design deep. It's very easy to use them just for the sake of design, but they also provide the opportunity to truly dig deeper and create design work that is genuinely consistent in its visual and physical language. And having this kind of capability inside a no-code tool is a big deal. Click the link in the description or the pinned comment to try it all out for yourself. And as a reminder, we were talking about windowed mode in iPadOS, and we wanted to examine how it works through the lens of the operating system logical consistency. The post-PC concept implies shifting the focus from files to application. You don't think about the internal structure of the file system or how materials are organized, as it customary on desktop. But if you think about it, applications are merely conduit layer, not the essence of the approach itself. Conceptually, we're invited to think in contextual task flows, using application as tools for this. Hence the full screen mode. The operating system especially ceased to exist at that moment. Your iPad with an open application is entirely documented in Google Doc, Notion or YouTube. Except for professional, a single application is too constrained to maintain such a task flow. Programs solve this by giving us tabs, allowing us to juggle multiple materials with a single app. This is a significant expansion of the workspace, but it runs into two problems. First, far from all apps, even major ones, support eternal multitasking. In Google Docs, for example, it's simply impossible to comfortably work with multiple documents simultaneously. And second, we still have a category of professionals who need context from several different applications at once. For example, I might be researching material on YouTube and web, writing it all down in Notion, while keeping a chat with Gemini open to help process information. And there is no need to say, then just switch to a MacBook, if only because I already work on one. But for people accustomed to the post-PC concept, it is entirely natural to want to solve all their tasks within the familiar paradigm, especially when there is abundant technical power to do so, like the Apple Silicon processors in the iPad Pro. And from the developer's perspective, it's critical for Apple to continue evolving its unique system. Not to merge iPadOS with macOS, not to make it look like Android tablet, which, despite all its modern sophistication, is ultimately a follower of concept Steve Jobs created. The iPad remaining the only professional tool on the market built and operating entirely within the post-PC concept, or rather it was until last year. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. How did Apple originally solve these problems for professionals? First came split view, placing two applications on the screen. This allows you to work in two environments simultaneously without creating unnecessary entities and, most importantly, without violating the cardinal rule. While you're working, the iPad system is invisible. There are only your tools and your workflow. Then came more, slide over, an additional third application that could be always summoned with simple swipe and easily tucked away. Perfect for messengers or AI, so you're free to invent your own use cases. This was an uncompromising increase of iPadOS bandwidth for heavy tasks. But the next step proved to be a compromise. Enter Stage Manager, a new multitasking mode. The main upgrade, up to 4 applications on stage instead of 2. And as many of these stages simultaneously as you want, which effectively removed any limitation, allowing you to create any application configuration tailored to your needs. In some ways, it's an elegant, scalable solution without limits. The list of stages on the left wasn't a major issue, because it was easily hidden, but the arrangement of windows within the stage became freeform. And this meant the introduction of something that had never existed on the iPad before. Space. Not quite desktop space yet, but stage space. We'll discuss why this distinction matters in the moment. But the key takeaway is that space is an element of the operating system, and with its arrival, interaction with task flow departed from the original concept of an invisible system where only applications exist. Here I want to recall the philosopher Martin Heidegger and his concept of readiness to hand. He wrote that when a tool works predictably and reliably, we stop perceiving it as an external object. It becomes an organic extension of ourselves. Decades later, this philosophical insight was corroborated by neurobiology. MRI scans shows that when working with a familiar, well-functioning tool, the brain genuinely maps it as a part of the body schema. When working with a bad hammer, where the head might fly off at any moment, the brain perceived both the hammer and the nail as an external objects. But a good hammer is functionally integrated into body by brain, allowing you to adapt faster and not waste cognitive resources on controlling the tool. Apple engineers are outstanding masters at hacking this exact brain function. Throughout the Steve Jobs era, they created designs aimed not just at functionality or aesthetic, but at seamlessness and predictability. So some of that interfaces could be read without training, purely on instinct. This is what I classify as anthropological design. Classic multitasking on the iPad or iPhone is exactly this kind of simple, instinctively understood pattern. You have a stack of full-screen app cards that you swipe through. Stage Manager is a complicated system. Instead of individual cards, we got grouped piles of applications. And the moment this happened, the brain started asking the interface questions. Can one app be two stages simultaneously if I'm using it in different context? What size will a new window open at? How do I retrieve an app buried beneath the rest? Inherently, these are normal questions, but the mere fact that they arise tells us that this is no longer anthropological design. This is design one level down, functional. And while functional design isn't a death sentence, far from anything can be designed at an anthropological level, just by its nature. The system became more complex. Fortunately, the old model was preserved. A reminder, that's the classic split view plus picture-in-picture and slide over. But yes, this scheme was slightly clunky and compromised, but it remained logical and cohesive. And it still suited the absolute majority of users. The main structural awkwardness was that the very behavior of the operating system, the absolute foundation of interacting with the device, could now be radically altered by flipping a single toggle in the settings. Personally, I'm convinced that this complexity could have been implemented without creating a separate toggle entity, by gradually integrating new capabilities into the baseline scenario. So it wouldn't be jarring jump in functionality, but a smooth mastery of the interfaces as the user's own task grew more and more complex. Yet here in my hands is an iPad Pro M4 updated to iPadOS 26. If I try to use the familiar split view here, nothing happens. Try slide over, it doesn't work either. This is a mode with a single capability, full screen application. A pure post-PC concept. So pure that this has become almost entirely unfit for actual work, entirely useful. So what are those who need to work supposed to do? Welcome to the brand new mode, windowed app. Split view and slide over are now exclusively available there. And all of it exists strictly within the paradigm of free-floating windows. The essence of the window paradigm lies in the presence of a space we mentioned before. There is a desktop, and documents lie on the top of it. Working on a desktop, we inherently know that beneath the windows lies the constant surface of the desktop. This is where the physics of this space resides. The problem of cramped desktop has long been solved by multiple virtual desktops, a feature present in both macOS and many Linux distributives. It's an excellent solution for small monitors, one that I personally use constantly on my 14-inch MacBook, but my 11-inch iPad lacks this feature. The foundation of any post-PC device is what was originally called the springboard, the grid of application icons. Effectively, it's an overgrown dock from macOS. But when operating in windowed app mode, this familiar home screen with the springboard is not the background. The background is simply wallpaper. Worse still, running parallel to this regular space of windowed application are full-screen apps, operating by an entirely different set of laws. I honestly spent time listening to Apple's own designers describe the logic of the new system, and it only cemented my conclusions. There is no unified system or concept here. It's a direct copy-paste of familiar desktop functions, and a copy made without regarding for details or elemental logic. For example, the familiar three dots appears at the top of the window, but functionally, the minimize button on the iPadOS paradigm is now no different from the close button. Even on a visual level, serious complications arise. In some interfaces, a massive number of nesting levels are layered on top of each other, entirely unjustified architecturally. And as a reminder, you can no longer exist in the old familiar mode. The standard full-screen mode has been stripped all of features that allowed you to combine multiple apps simultaneously. Interesting, yet during the more careful transition into the Stage Manager before, the classic full-screen mode retained 100% of its functionality. Remember when I mentioned the curse of modern operating systems? They remained too good even when they become objectively bad. Despite all the interface contradiction, the shattered logic and the total loss of focus on developing the post-PC paradigm, the iPad continues to be a functional tool even on iPadOS 26. But the problem is that by choosing this desktop evolutionary branch for the only popular and fully realized tool for the post-PC era, we are in all likelihood witnessing the end of the concept itself. I'm not saying the iPad is going to disappear or that these UX problems are technically unsolvable. I am saying that the fundamental element of system interactions such as multitasking logic and cursor behavior are the brightest indicators of the development direction. You simply can't find a brighter signal, and today they no longer exist within the post-PC ideology. I'm sure rolling back architectural shifts like this will not be easy. I have a detailed article on my Substack where regularly publishing design essays, analyzing why flawed structural decisions like this tend to cement themselves and stay with us forever. A fair doubt might arise here, but this is exactly what people asked for. They wanted a mouse, Flaw in Windows, and classic files. There is a famous quote attributed to Henry Ford. If I had asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. I think the situation with the iPad is even worse. It's an already invented automobile that for some reason has started imitating a horse. Metamorphoses like this make it a bad car, but they certainly won't turn it back into a horse. And of course, all these interface contradictions fade away when you're simply consuming content. In reading or viewing mode, everything remains cohesive. It's still magic at your fingertips. But the moment we step outside of consumption and try to build a workflow, the magic breaks. Undoubtedly, the magic of design doesn't lie merely in blindly following an initial dogma. Far from every concept is even born viable. But there was one little-known rule that once elevated Apple's design level above the entire rest of the industry. It worked so effectively that even today brand loyalty largely rests on the inertia of decisions made in that era. I'm talking about that very anthropological design. The departure from this level of engineering happened long ago, alongside the breakup of the great triumvirate Jobs, Ive and Forstall. People who were capable not just drawing interfaces, but of inventing concepts that define the physics of our digital world. And I invite you to see exactly how this unequivocally fading world worked in my separate video about the 3 levels of design, where the highest, third level, is precisely this anthropological approach. And that's all for today. See you.